I never saw it coming. Isn't that how betrayal always feels? Like a hidden trapdoor beneath your feet, waiting for you to take one careless step. That's how it was for me. In the beginning, I thought I had everything I could want. MIA and I had built a life together, filled with laughter, shared dreams, and those quiet, intimate moments I'd always believed were sacred. We met in college, fell in love over late-night study sessions and cups of cheap coffee. And I thought she was the best thing that ever happened to me. Then there was Liam, my best friend since grade school. We'd been through every phase of life together, sharing victories, losses, the highs and lows. He was more like a brother to me than just a friend. The three of us, MIA, Liam, and I, formed this close circle. We'd spend weekends together, going on hikes, cooking big meals, watching movies, and sometimes just talking about life over a bottle of wine. It was the kind of friendship that felt indestructible, the kind I thought would last a lifetime. Looking back now, I can see the red flags. They weren't big, nothing you'd notice unless you were actively looking for them. A glance that lingered just a second too long. The occasional joke that I wasn't in on. The small silences that felt a little too loaded. But at the time, I dismissed them as my imagination. Or just moments of nothing. MIA and Liam had known each other for years. After all, I introduced them, and they had every reason to be close. Then one night, it all unraveled. I was finishing up some work late at the office when I got a text from MIA saying she was having a night in with friends. I thought nothing of it. It wasn't unusual. But as I sat there, for some reason, I started feeling uneasy. Call it intuition, paranoia, whatever it was. It made my skin crawl. I told myself I was being ridiculous. That MIA would never betray me. But the uneasiness lingered, gnawing at me until I decided to check something. I logged onto our phone account. Just out of curiosity. I rarely looked at it. But that night, something pushed me to go over the records. I wish I hadn't. Right there, in plain sight, was call after call to Liam. Late at night, often when she told me she was out with friends or at the gym. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding as the truth started to sink in. The times matched up too perfectly, there was no mistaking it. MIA was hiding something, and she was hiding it with Liam. My hands were shaking. I couldn't bring myself to confront her that night. I needed to know more. Maybe I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, but I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. So, over the next few days, I started watching for anything that would give me a clearer picture. I was subtle, never letting on that I knew. Then came the moment that changed everything. I'd come home from work early one afternoon, hoping to surprise MIA with dinner. I walked in, feeling that same sense of discomfort I'd felt in the office. And as I opened the door to our living room, there it was, her phone on the coffee table. Unlocked. I picked it up, telling myself I wouldn't dig too far, that I'd just take a quick look to ease my mind. But as soon as I opened her messages, the truth hit me like a sledgehammer. There were photos, texts, things that left nothing to the imagination. Messages exchanged between her and Liam. Things I couldn't unsee. I scrolled, numb, reading every word. Words that should have been meant for me. I could almost hear her voice in each line. See her smile in the photos. But it was all directed at Liam. I felt my stomach churn. A cold numbness settling over me. It felt like every memory I had of her, of us, was splintering, shattering into pieces. Every, I love you, she'd ever whispered to me. Every promise, now felt like a lie. I sank down onto the couch, clutching her phone as if it was some kind of proof that I'd wake up from this nightmare. But there was no waking up. This was my reality now. I'd spent years trusting these two people, believing they were my foundation, my constants. But in that moment, I realized they had been tearing me apart in secret, piece by piece. It was strange, sitting there in our living room with the evidence right in front of me. I expected rage or devastation. Instead, I felt hollow. It was like watching my own life from the outside, as if the betrayal hadn't happened to me but to someone else. I stared around at our shared space, the photos on the walls, the souvenirs from our vacations, the books we'd picked out together. Everything felt tainted, the love I'd believed in reduced to a farce. I didn't confront MIA that night. Instead, I sat alone in that empty room, feeling the silence press in on me. My thoughts were chaotic, bouncing between disbelief and bitterness. I couldn't make sense of how the woman I loved and the friend I trusted could betray me so completely. I kept waiting for the pain to come, but all I felt was numb. The following days were a blur. I went through my daily routines on autopilot, trying to convince myself that I was fine, that I could keep going like nothing had happened. But every time I saw her, every time I heard her laugh or saw her smile, I felt a chasm opening up between us. I couldn't look at her without seeing those messages, those pictures, One night, as I lay next to her in bed, unable to sleep, I realized I was teetering on the edge of something dark. I knew that if I let this fester, it would destroy me. It was no longer just a betrayal, it was an infection, seeping into every corner of my life, poisoning me from the inside out. I had to do something. Sitting there, powerless, wasn't an option anymore. If they thought I would just accept this and move on, they were wrong. I wasn't the same person I had been a week ago. They had shattered that version of me. Now, I felt the cold steel of determination setting in, a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of purpose. I didn't know what my next steps would be, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't let them get away with it. I wasn't going to be the passive victim in this story. They thought they could go on with their lives without consequence. They thought they could walk all over me, but they were about to find out just how wrong they were. And as I lay there, staring into the darkness, I made a silent vow to myself. This was only the beginning. I would find a way to confront them both, to make them face the reality of what they'd done, and I wouldn't rest until I'd taken back the control they had tried to steal from me. In the days that followed, I felt like I was slipping into quicksand, sinking slowly with no way to pull myself out. I'd go through the motions of everyday life, putting on a face for the world that hid the storm raging underneath. Outwardly, nothing seemed wrong. I still woke up next to MIA, still went to work, still made small talk with people I met. But inside, I was fractured, barely holding myself together. I started questioning everything, every moment, every memory, every decision I'd ever made in my life. I'd look at myself in the mirror, barely recognizing the person staring back. How could I have been so blind, so naive? For years, I'd prided myself on my ability to read people, on my loyalty, my honesty. I thought I was a good man, a good husband, and a good friend. But now, all of that felt like a lie. The worst part was the silence. It was everywhere. It filled the house, pressing in on me when I was alone, echoing my doubts and amplifying my fears. I'd go to bed at night, lying next to MIA, listening to her even breaths, and feel the crushing weight of the things left unsaid. I was afraid to confront her, terrified of what she might say, of the confirmation that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad dream. Because once I heard her admit it, I knew there would be no going back. It wasn't just MIA. Though, Liam's betrayal cut just as deep. He'd been my best friend for years, the one person I trusted above anyone else. I found myself replaying every moment we'd shared, searching for any sign that he'd been lying to me all along. It made me question myself in ways I never had before. Was I a fool? Had I missed the signs because I was too trusting? Or was I just not good enough, somehow lacking in ways I didn't understand? On a particularly bad night, I drove aimlessly, barely noticing the streets passing by in a blur. The familiar landmarks felt foreign, distant, as if they belonged to someone else's life. I ended up at a park on the edge of town, where I used to come with Liam in high school, and just sat there, staring at the empty playground, the vacant benches. I felt like a ghost in my own life. I couldn't talk to anyone about it. I felt too ashamed, too humiliated. The idea of telling someone, of admitting that I'd been betrayed so thoroughly by the people I loved most, was too painful to bear. So I kept it all inside, letting it simmer and build until it was like a pressure cooker in my chest. Every day, I felt the weight of it more acutely, the suffocating knowledge that my entire life had been ripped out from under me. I tried to distract myself. I threw myself into work, staying late just to avoid going home. I went for long runs, pushing myself to the brink of exhaustion so I wouldn't have to think. But it didn't help. The betrayal was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, drenched in sweat, as if the truth was some kind of shadow stalking me. It was around this time that the self-doubt started creeping in. Slowly at first, then all at once. I began to wonder if I was to blame. Was there something about me that made me easy to betray? Was I too trusting, too naive? I combed through my memories of our relationship, trying to pinpoint any moment that might explain why MIA had turned to someone else where she turned to him. I started questioning my worth, wondering if I'd ever been good enough for her. I replayed every fight, every misunderstanding, every moment of insecurity, wondering if they had been the start of her drift away from me. I wondered if I'd driven her to this somehow, if I'd been so wrapped up in my own life that I'd neglected the cracks in our relationship. It was a kind of twisted self-torture, but I couldn't stop. The pain became a kind of ritual, a punishment I thought I deserved. And yet, through all of it, there was a small part of me that wanted to believe she still loved me. That maybe this was all just a terrible mistake. That maybe, just maybe, she'd made a choice she regretted, and we could somehow rebuild. But even as I thought it, I knew it was a fantasy. The messages I'd seen, the photos, those weren't mistakes. They were choices, deliberate and calculated. She'd chosen him over and over again, knowing what it would do to me. The realization broke something in me. I'd always thought of love as something sacred, something pure, but now it felt tainted, poisoned. I couldn't look at her without feeling a wave of disgust and betrayal. It was as if she'd taken everything we'd built together and torn it apart. Piece by piece, with every lie, every secret, every whispered word meant for someone else. In a strange way, the pain started to feel like armor, something I could use to shield myself from the world. I stopped caring about appearances, stopped pretending that everything was fine. I let the darkness in, allowing it to wrap around me like a blanket. I was done pretending. If MIA and Liam thought they could destroy me and walk away unscathed, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. One night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, a thought struck me. I didn't have to suffer in silence. I didn't have to let them get away with this. I wasn't powerless, no matter how much they tried to make me feel that way. I could still take control, still do something to make them face the reality of what they'd done. The idea took root, growing slowly, feeding off the pain and anger I'd buried deep inside. I wasn't sure what my next move would be, but I knew one thing: I couldn't let them continue on as if nothing had happened. They deserved to feel the weight of their choices, to understand the depth of the hurt they'd caused. I wouldn't be passive anymore. I was done being the victim in their story. That night, for the first time since I'd discovered the betrayal, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was a cold, steady resolve, a determination that cut through the fog of grief like a blade. I knew that it wouldn't be easy, that there would be moments when the pain would come rushing back, threatening to drown me all over again, but I also knew that I couldn't stay in this place of despair forever. I was ready to confront them both, to expose the lies, to strip away the illusion they'd tried to create, and I would make sure they felt every ounce of the betrayal they'd inflicted on me. I would not let them walk away from this without consequences. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the room, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I didn't have all the answers yet, didn't know exactly what my next steps would be, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of purpose. This was only the beginning. And I knew one thing for certain: they had shattered my heart. But they hadn't destroyed me. Not yet. When the numbness finally started to wear off, all that remained was a fierce, burning anger. It was like a flame that refused to go out, simmering under every thought, every breath. This anger wasn't loud or explosive, it was quiet and steady, fueling a determination I hadn't felt before. I was done letting them walk all over me. I wasn't the naive, trusting person they thought I was. And I wasn't about to play the role of the broken-hearted victim. I would be the one pulling the strings now. The first thing I did was start looking into everything I could about Mia's and Liam's lives. I needed to know how deep this went, how long it had been happening, and whether there was anyone else who knew. I went through bank statements, scrutinized our joint finances, and made a list of every unusual expense or unexplained withdrawal. I couldn't risk any loose ends. I needed to know exactly where I stood, financially and emotionally, if I was going to confront them on my terms. MIA had always handled most of the bills and finances. I'd trusted her implicitly, barely giving a second thought to our money. But now I realized how much control I'd surrendered. So, I spent late nights poring over every transaction, every shared account, tracking anything that seemed suspicious. It was grueling, like peeling back layers of a life I'd believed in, only to find rot beneath the surface. Yet the deeper I dug, the clearer everything became. The things I uncovered were as heartbreaking as they were infuriating. Romantic dinners, weekend getaways, gifts all paid for with our shared funds. I couldn't believe I'd been so blind, so oblivious. They had used the life we'd built together as a playground for the deceit. Seeing those transactions listed in cold, hard numbers left me feeling hollowed out. I printed every statement, every email, every bit of proof I could gather. I wanted to have it all ready when the time came to confront them, to make them face the evidence of their betrayal. I started preparing myself emotionally, too, imagining every possible reaction MIA or Liam might have. I knew MIA would try to lie, maybe even try to spin it to make me feel guilty. She was good at that, turning things around, making me second-guess myself. And Liam, I expected him to put on some sad face, mumble apologies, maybe try to brush it off as a mistake. But I knew it was no mistake. They had both made choices, again and again, knowing exactly what they were doing. In those quiet, rage-fueled nights, I planned out different scenarios. I rehearsed each confrontation, every possible answer to every lie they might throw at me. I knew I had to stay calm, to control my emotions if I wanted the upper hand. The last thing I wanted was to give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I wanted them to see that I was in control now, that I had seen through them. They would be the ones caught off guard. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that a simple confrontation wouldn't be enough. Words could be twisted, emotions could be manipulated. No, I wanted something undeniable, something that would make them feel the full weight of what they'd done. I wanted consequences, real consequences, that they couldn't walk away from. And that's when I decided to consult a lawyer. I'd never thought I'd be the kind of person to do something like that. But life has a way of changing you, of turning you into someone you barely recognize when you're pushed far enough. I met with a divorce attorney, laying everything out for him, showing him the evidence I'd gathered. He listened, expression unreadable, then nodded, explaining the legal options available to me. In some ways, it felt strange to talk about it so clinically, to reduce years of love, trust, and friendship to terms like assets, liabilities, and infidelity. But in that cold, sterile office, I felt an odd sense of relief. This wasn't just a betrayal of the heart, it was a betrayal that carried real consequences. And I wanted him to feel every single one. The attorney advised me to document everything, to keep gathering proof, and to avoid tipping my hand until the moment was right. He explained that if I played my cards carefully, I could protect my assets and make the divorce as unfavorable to MIA as possible. It was vindictive, maybe even ruthless, but I didn't care. I wanted her to understand what it felt like to lose something she'd taken for granted. And Liam, well, I had plans for him too. With the legal strategy in place, I spent my nights planning how I'd finally confront them. I imagined the setting, the cold, stark living room, the silence pressing in around us, the weight of my accusations hanging in the air. I'd pull out the evidence, lay it all out before them, watch their faces as they realized there was no escape, no excuse. I wanted him to feel small, to feel powerless, just as they had made me feel. One evening, I sat alone, the printed messages and bank statements spread out in front of me like pieces of a broken puzzle. It was a strange feeling, like looking at a stranger's life. All these fragments of Mia's and Liam's betrayal, they no longer felt personal. They were just facts, data, cold and detached. And in that detachment, I found a strange sense of power. I started to realize that confronting them wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my self-respect. For too long, I'd let myself be a victim, wallowing in self-pity and shame. But this confrontation, it was my way of taking back control, of standing up for myself in a way I hadn't before. It was about showing them, and myself, that I was more than the broken man they'd left behind. The night before I planned to confront them, I barely slept. I felt strangely calm, as if every emotion, every ounce of anger and pain, had crystallized into a cold, unwavering resolve. I knew that this would be a turning point, the moment that would define the rest of my life. And I was ready. The next day, I left work early, heading home with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The house was empty, as I'd expected, giving me a few hours to prepare. I set the evidence on the coffee table, arranging it neatly. I wanted there to be no question, no confusion. This was real. This was happening. When MIA walked in that evening, she looked surprised to see me. There was a brief flash of something in her eyes, guilt, maybe fear, but she quickly covered it, putting on that familiar smile, the one that had once felt so genuine. It was a mask now, a hollow echo of the woman I thought I'd known. I told her we needed to talk, gesturing for her to sit down. I kept my voice steady, my face blank, watching her as she settled onto the couch. I didn't need to say much. The evidence in front of her spoke louder than any words could. She glanced down, her face paling as she realized what I'd laid out for her. She tried to stammer an explanation, to weave some feeble excuse. But I cut her off. I told her that there was no room for lies. Not anymore. I told her that I'd seen everything, that I knew everything, and then I sat back, watching as she struggled to find words, to muster some shred of dignity. But there was none left. She'd burned it all away with her choices. I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. There was no triumphant moment, no sense of victory. Instead, I felt a quiet, aching release, a letting go of something I'd clung to for too long. This confrontation wasn't for her. It was for me. It was a chance to say goodbye to the life I'd once believed in, to the love I'd once cherished. When she finally fell silent, realizing that there was nothing she could say to fix this, I told her it was over. I didn't raise my voice, didn't let a single tear fall. I was calm, detached. I'd already shed my tears in private, in the dark, in the solitude of my own mind. As I left the room, I felt a strange weight lift off my shoulders. I was free, in a way I hadn't felt in years. Free from the lies, from the betrayal, from the person I'd been before. And as I walked out of that house, I knew that this was just the beginning. This wasn't just about the end of a marriage or the loss of a friend. It was the beginning of something new, a life that was mine. Unburdened by the shadows of the past. And whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it, knowing that I was stronger, more resilient than I'd ever thought possible. The house felt different after MIA left. It was as if a weight I hadn't fully recognized had lifted, leaving an empty, unfamiliar quiet in its place. I'd packed her things, boxed up the remnants of what I thought our life was, and left him outside for her to pick up without a word. It was as clinical as possible. I didn't want another tearful goodbye or any dramatic confrontation. It was over, but as I looked around at the hollow spaces left behind, I felt a pang of something that almost bordered on grief. It was strange, feeling that for someone who had torn my heart out, but it wasn't just her that I mourned, it was the life I'd built. The future I thought we'd share. Every corner of the house, every framed photo and souvenir, held memories I'd cherished, and now, all of it felt tainted. I knew I couldn't stay there. The walls echoed with reminders, and I needed to find a way to leave them behind if I wanted to move forward. So, with a sense of detachment, I started clearing out everything that felt too heavy to keep. The house slowly turned into a blank slate as I took down photos, packed away furniture, and stripped each room bare. I'd always been the sentimental type, holding on to things that reminded me of good times. But now, I was ready to start fresh, to let go of the weight of the past. But letting go of physical things was one thing. The memories, the emotions, they clung to me with a persistence I hadn't expected. Nights were the worst. When the quiet settled in, I'd find myself lying awake, replaying every moment, every word, every memory I'd built with her. I found myself trapped between the anger that still simmered and the ache of a love that, despite everything, hadn't completely died. I wished I could erase her entirely, cut out the part of me that still cared, but that wasn't how it worked. So, I tried to keep busy. I dove headfirst into work, picking up extra projects, volunteering for assignments that took up my evenings. My boss thought I was aiming for a promotion, but the truth was simpler. I needed to be too tired to think, too drained to feel. I started going to the gym after work, pushing myself until my muscles ached, hoping that the physical exhaustion would drown out the emotional one. I even signed up for classes, anything to fill the hours and keep my mind from wandering back to her and the life we'd built. And slowly, over time, the pain began to dull. It didn't disappear, it was more like a bruise that fades but still hurts when pressed. But I could feel myself growing stronger. Bit by bit, I was rediscovering parts of myself that I'd let go of during my years with MIA. I'd been so wrapped up in being the perfect husband, the devoted friend, that I'd neglected my own passions, my own dreams. I started doing things I hadn't done in years. I picked up my guitar again, the one I'd shoved into the closet when MIA said she preferred quieter hobbies. I spent hours relearning old songs, letting the music fill the silence of my empty house. I even began painting, something I'd done back in college but had abandoned when life got busy. It was strange, feeling the freedom to do whatever I wanted, to be whoever I wanted, without worrying about anyone else's approval or preferences. It was liberating, and in a way, it was a return to myself. Then, one day, I took a leap I hadn't thought I was ready for. I decided to sell the house. It wasn't just a house to me, it was a chapter of my life. A monument to the years I'd spent building something that turned out to be a lie. Letting it go felt like the final act of shedding the weight of the past. A step toward a life that was entirely mine. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be days when I'd look back with a sense of loss. But I also knew that I couldn't move forward if I stayed rooted in a place that held so much pain. The process of selling and moving was exhausting, but it was also cleansing. I chose a small apartment in a part of town I'd always liked but never considered. It was a place without memories, without any connection to MIA or Liam or the life I was leaving behind. Moving in felt like a fresh start, like I was finally closing the door on a chapter that had drained me of everything I once was. In those early days in my new place, I felt an odd mixture of excitement and loneliness. It was strange, waking up alone, making coffee for one, navigating a routine that was entirely my own. There were moments when I missed the comfort of companionship, the ease of sharing a life with someone else. But I also felt a quiet satisfaction in my independence, a sense of pride in rebuilding my life on my terms. I threw myself into exploring the city, finding new favorite spots, making friends with neighbors, reconnecting with family. For years, I'd been so focused on MIA and Liam that I'd neglected the other relationships in my life. Now, with him out of the picture, I realized how many people I'd drifted from, people who had stood by me without question. I reached out to them, rekindling friendships I'd let go, finding solace in their support. One afternoon, while unpacking a box of old keepsakes, I came across an old photo of Liam and me from high school. We were laughing, arms around each other, faces full of the carefree innocence of youth. I looked at it for a long time, feeling a pang of sadness and anger. That friendship had been real. Once, he had been my brother in every way that mattered. And now, all that remained were memories. Tainted by his betrayal, I felt a strange sense of closure, realizing that I didn't need to hold on to the anger anymore. It wouldn't change what had happened, but I could choose to move forward without it. Letting go of that anger was harder than I thought. It had become such a constant companion, a shield that kept me going in those early days. But as I settled into my new life, I found it easier to breathe without it, to let it fade into the background. Forgiveness wasn't about absolving him or MIA, it was about freeing myself from the bitterness that had taken hold of me. I didn't need him to apologize, to explain, or to make amends. I didn't need anything from them. I was finally whole on my own. One evening, as I sat on the small balcony of my new apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt a quiet sense of peace. I realized that I didn't hate MIA or Liam anymore. They had taken something precious from me, something I could never get back, but they hadn't taken me. I was still here, still standing, still alive, and in a strange way, I felt grateful for that realization. The journey had stripped me bare, forcing me to confront parts of myself I'd long buried. It had hurt in ways I couldn't put into words, but it had also made me stronger, more resilient. I wasn't the person I'd been before all this happened, and I knew I never would be again. But maybe that was okay. Maybe this new version of me was someone I could be proud of. As the weeks turned into months, I felt myself settling into this new life with a sense of purpose. I made plans for the future, goals that were entirely my own. Unshackled from the past, I took up painting seriously, even signed up for a local art show. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental, a symbol of my commitment to move forward. And as I stood in that gallery months later, surrounded by strangers admiring my work, I realized that I was finally free. Free from the pain, the betrayal, the bitterness, free from the shadows that had clung to me for so long. I had reclaimed my life, piece by piece, and in that moment, I knew I was ready for whatever lay ahead. The past was behind me now, a part of my story but no longer the defining chapter. I was ready to close that book, to let it rest on a shelf where it belonged. My life was my own again, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the thrill of new beginnings. The promise of a future that was entirely mine. Living alone, in my own space, was something I hadn't done in years. I hadn't realized how much I'd relied on Mia's presence to define the rhythms of my life. The way you rely on familiar routines. But now, it was just me. The silence was mine to fill. The days were mine to shape. And, for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of ownership over my life. In those first few months in my new apartment, I kept myself busy, not just with work but with exploring who I was beyond my old roles of husband and friend. I'd spent so much of my life fitting myself around other people's expectations that I wasn't even sure what I genuinely enjoyed. It was like meeting myself for the first time, rediscovering an identity that had been buried under years of compromises and self-sacrifice. I tried new things just to see what stuck. I went to art shows, took a couple of cooking classes, and even attended a local book club. I was quiet, listening more than I spoke, trying to soak in the perspectives of people I'd just met, people who didn't know my story. It was refreshing, being around strangers who saw me as I was now, without the shadow of my past. No one asked me about MIA, and no one looked at me with that pity I'd come to dread. Here, I could just be Ethan, the quiet guy with an interest in art and an eagerness to learn. It was in those moments of solitude and self-discovery that I started to feel a new kind of joy. One that didn't depend on anyone else. I'd come to appreciate the quietness of my mornings. The freedom to read for hours without interruption, to cook simple meals and take long walks through the city, letting my mind wander without restraint. The loneliness I'd feared turned into a solitude I cherished, a peacefulness I hadn't known I'd needed. One evening, after a particularly good day at work, I found myself walking to an art store and buying new canvases and paints. I wasn't even sure what I'd paint, but something inside me craved the colors. The act of creation. I started painting regularly, letting whatever was buried inside me spill onto the canvas without overthinking it. Some nights, I'd paint until the early hours of the morning, losing myself in the process, pouring my emotions into each stroke. It became my therapy, a way to express feelings I couldn't put into words. Eventually, I decided to submit a few pieces to a local art exhibit. I didn't expect much, I wasn't trying to make a statement, but when I saw my work displayed on those gallery walls, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. It was a quiet, steady pride, a feeling of accomplishment that didn't depend on anyone else's validation. I'd made something of my own, and I was finally ready to share it with the world. Slowly, the bitterness and anger I'd clung to started to fade. I stopped thinking about Mia and Liam, stopped replaying those memories that had once haunted me. I realized that I didn't need closure from them. The closure I needed was within me, in the life I was building, in the small but significant steps I was taking every day. I no longer felt the urge to explain my side of the story to anyone or to seek understanding. I had all the understanding I needed. One afternoon, as I walked through the city, I saw a couple laughing together at a cafe, their heads close, hands intertwined. A pang of sadness hit me, but it wasn't the sharp, cutting pain it once was. It was more like an ache, a reminder of what had been and what was no longer. I realized then that I could feel happy for them, whoever they were. Love, I understood now, wasn't something I needed to fear or avoid. It was something beautiful that I could appreciate, even if it wasn't mine at that moment. For the first time, I felt like I could look at love with gratitude rather than grief. As the months passed, I began to reconnect with parts of my past that I'd neglected. I started visiting my parents more often, catching up with old friends I hadn't seen in years. I realized how many people had stood by me, even when I hadn't been fully present in their lives. They didn't ask me for explanations or updates. They just welcomed me back with open arms, and their kindness felt like a balm to my soul. I found myself laughing more, feeling lighter in their presence, enjoying the simplicity of those friendships. I also started spending weekends exploring nearby towns, going on day trips just for the sake of it. I'd grab my camera, take photos of landscapes and people, immersing myself in the world around me without any agenda. These moments, these little adventures, reminded me of the freedom I had, the life that was still mine to shape however I wanted. There was no one to hold me back, no expectations to meet. It was just me and the open road, a world of possibility stretching before me. The more I let go, the more at peace I felt. Forgiving Mia and Liam wasn't something I did all at once, it was a gradual process. A choice I made each day. It wasn't about excusing their actions or pretending the hurt didn't exist. It was about freeing myself from the anger and resentment, about releasing the grip they had on my life. I realized that holding on to that bitterness only weighed me down, kept me rooted in a past I was ready to leave behind. One day, as I sat in my small apartment, a strange sense of contentment washed over me. I looked around at the life I'd created, the space I'd filled with my art, my books, my memories, and I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This life wasn't perfect, it wasn't flashy, but it was mine. Every piece of it had been hard-won, earned through the struggle and pain of rebuilding. And in that simplicity, I found a happiness that was deeper and more fulfilling than anything I'd known before. I knew that this journey wasn't over, that there would be days when the past would resurface, when I'd feel the sting of old wounds. But I also knew that I was strong enough to handle it. That I had built a foundation of self-respect, self-love, and resilience that would carry me through. I had come to understand that my life wasn't defined by my past or by the people who had hurt me. It was defined by how I chose to move forward, by the choices I made each day to live with integrity, to seek joy, to find purpose in the simplest of things. As I closed my eyes that night, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet assurance that I was exactly where I was meant to be. My story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning, and whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges, whatever joys, whatever love, I was ready to face it with an open heart, knowing that I had reclaimed my life and my worth, not for anyone else but for myself. I'd survived betrayal, endured heartbreak, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more whole than I'd ever thought possible. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Looking back, it's strange to see how far I've come. When I think about that period of my life, the heartbreak, the anger, the long nights filled with doubt, it feels like a lifetime ago. Like a story that happened to someone else. In some ways, it did. I'm not the person I was back then. I carry pieces of him, of course. But I've grown into someone stronger. Someone who knows himself a little better. It's funny how life can change us in ways we'd never choose for ourselves. If you'd asked me years ago who I thought I'd be by now, I wouldn't have had any idea. Back then, I thought I had it all mapped out, a future I could predict. A life filled with familiar faces and steady routines. But life has a way of undoing our plans, of breaking us down so we can become something new. In those days, when the pain was still fresh and raw, I didn't think I'd ever feel whole again. I felt like a house stripped down to its bare walls. The foundation cracked, nothing left but rubble. But now, I see that I was rebuilding myself all along, brick by brick, in ways I hadn't even noticed. I found strength in places I didn't know existed, resilience I hadn't known I was capable of. And while I wouldn't wish that kind of heartbreak on anyone, I'm grateful for the person it led me to become. Mia and Liam have become distant memories. I still think of them sometimes. In flashes, like old photographs that you stumble across unexpectedly. But the bitterness is gone, replaced by a strange sort of gratitude. They taught me lessons I could never have learned otherwise. I realized that love, as beautiful as it is, doesn't guarantee loyalty, that trust, once broken, can't always be rebuilt, and that sometimes, people we thought would be by our side forever are meant only to be chapters in our story. Not the whole book. It's hard to say when the anger left me. It was a gradual process, like a fog lifting slowly, day by day. At some point, I realized I wasn't carrying that weight anymore. I didn't need their apology or their explanations. I didn't need closure from anyone but myself. And in that realization, I found freedom. They no longer had any power over me, no place in my life except as a reminder of how far I'd come. There was a time when I thought forgiveness meant letting them off the hook, excusing their actions, but I see it differently now. Forgiveness, I've learned, is about freeing yourself from the shackles of anger and resentment. It's about reclaiming your life, your peace of mind, and moving forward without the burden of old wounds. And so, I forgave them not for them, but for myself, because I deserved that peace. As I settled into this new life, I found that I didn't need anyone's validation but my own. The person I've become, the life I've created, it's mine, and I don't owe anyone explanations or apologies. I've learned to cherish my own company, to find joy in the small things, the quiet moments, the unexpected adventures. I've come to love the simplicity of my days, the freedom to pursue my passions, to fill my life with meaning on my terms. One evening, while going through a box of old papers, I found an old journal, one I hadn't opened in years. I started flipping through the pages, reading my old thoughts, my younger dreams. It was a strange, nostalgic experience, like looking into the mind of a stranger I used to know. I could see how naive I'd been, how eager to please, how willing to compromise, but there was also a certain innocence, a hopefulness, that I could still recognize in myself. It reminded me that life is a series of versions of ourselves, each one shaped by the experiences we endure. I wrote in that journal that night, filling a few pages with the things I'd learned, the lessons that had come out of the ashes. I wrote about strength, resilience, forgiveness. I wrote about learning to trust myself again, to find purpose beyond other people's expectations. I wrote about finding peace not in perfect circumstances but in the imperfect, unpredictable journey of life. There was a quiet satisfaction in putting those thoughts into words, in seeing them there, real and concrete. It was my way of marking this chapter as complete, of acknowledging the road I'd traveled and the person I'd become. And as I closed the journal and placed it back in the box, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the pain, but for the growth it had inspired. I don't know what the future holds for me, but for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of it. I'm open to whatever comes next, whether that means new friendships, new love, or just the simple pleasures of a life I've built on my own. I've come to appreciate the beauty of uncertainty, the freedom to create my own path, to follow my own dreams without anyone else's influence. The old wounds are scars now faint, barely noticeable, but a part of me nonetheless. They're reminders of a time when I was broken and lost, but also of the strength it took to rebuild. They remind me of who I am now, of the resilience that got me through the darkest nights. And though I may carry those scars for the rest of my life, they don't define me. They're just markers along the journey, part of the story that has shaped me into the person I am today. As I write this, looking out over the city, the lights twinkling against the darkening sky, I feel a profound sense of peace. I don't know what lies ahead, but I know that whatever it is, I'm ready. I'm stronger now, wiser, and more whole than I ever thought I could be. And for the first time, I feel like I truly belong to myself. This journey hasn't been easy, and I won't pretend that the scars will ever fully fade, but I've come to understand that healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward with grace and strength. It's about knowing that you are enough, just as you are, no matter what you've been through. So here I am, on the other side of heartbreak, standing on my own 2 feet. I don't need anyone else to complete me. I am complete in myself, whole and unbroken. Despite everything I've endured, I've reclaimed my life, my worth, and my happiness. And as I step forward into whatever the future holds, I do so with an open heart and an unshakable belief in myself. This is my story, my life, and I'm finally ready to live it on my terms. The past is behind me. The future awaits, and I am, at last, free. After everything I'd been through, I thought I'd finally reached a place where my life was complete. I was at peace. I felt free, but what I didn't expect was how much life was still waiting to be lived, how much more there was beyond the quiet satisfaction of surviving heartache. As the months went by, I began to feel something new taking root, a kind of restless excitement, a desire to do more than simply exist. For the first time, I didn't just want to reclaim what had been lost, I wanted to build something new. One day, on a whim, I decided to take a solo road trip. It wasn't planned, it was more of an impulse. An urge that struck me on an ordinary Thursday as I stared out my office window at the blue sky and rolling clouds. I put in for time off, packed up my old, reliable car with just the essentials, and set out with no clear destination in mind. It was strange and exhilarating to be driving with no agenda, no responsibilities pulling me back, just me, the open road, and the sense that anything could happen. I drove for hours, letting the scenery blur by, stopping in small towns whenever something caught my eye. I'd eat at little diners, strike up conversations with strangers, and capture moments with my camera, portraits of people, landscapes, fragments of life that felt vibrant and alive in ways I hadn't expected. Each town held a story, a history, and a charm all its own, and I drank it all in, savoring each experience like a precious gift. On the third day, I found myself in a small town nestled in the mountains, with charming streets lined with art galleries and local boutiques. It was peaceful, almost like a world tucked away from the chaos of modern life. As I wandered around, admiring the art on display in one of the galleries, I felt a spark of recognition. My paintings weren't so different from what I saw here, landscapes of personal journey, reflections of solitude and resilience. Before I knew it, I was talking to the gallery owner, a warm, enthusiastic woman named Carol, who had been running the gallery for decades. She asked about my work, and for the first time, I felt ready to talk about it, to share the meaning behind my pieces. She listened with genuine interest, her eyes lighting up as I described the journey that had led me here. And before I knew it, she'd invited me to showcase my work in a small show she was organizing later that month. It was a small opportunity, but something about it felt monumental. This was my art, my life, displayed not as a testament to past wounds, but as a celebration of growth. I returned to my apartment and worked tirelessly on new pieces, pouring all the fresh joy and freedom I felt into the colors and lines, creating with a sense of purpose that felt brand new. When the show finally came, I was nervous, but as I watched people admire my work, saw them moved by the emotions captured in each piece, I knew that this was what I wanted to share, to connect, to create a world that resonated with others. The show led to more opportunities. I found myself invited to other galleries, other shows, even receiving offers to teach art workshops. My life started to take on a rhythm that felt entirely my own, a blend of quiet creative solitude and moments of shared connection with people who valued what I brought to the world. I was building something new, not because I had to but because I wanted to. This wasn't just about surviving or recovering, this was about truly living. As time went on, I started to attract a small following in the art world. People would reach out, ask me about my inspiration, the emotions behind my work. I'd talk about resilience, about transformation, without diving into my personal history. And yet, somehow, those conversations left me feeling seen in ways that were deeply fulfilling. I realized that I didn't need to share every detail of my past to make a meaningful connection. My art spoke for itself, and through it, I found a language of healing and strength that reached others. One day, at an exhibit in a larger city, a young woman approached me. She was nervous, clutching a notebook to her chest, and told me that one of my paintings had moved her to tears. She explained that she was going through her own journey of loss and self-discovery, and seeing my work had given her a sense of hope, a feeling that she wasn't alone. Her words struck a deep chord in me, and I realized that my art had become more than a personal catharsis. It had become a way to offer solace, to extend a hand to others who were finding their way out of their own darkness. In that moment, I understood the full power of what I was doing. I wasn't just reclaiming my life for myself, I was creating a space for others to find their own strength, their own resilience. It was a gift I hadn't anticipated, but one that I cherished deeply. With each passing month, I felt myself growing, expanding into this new version of me. I'd once thought that love and connection could only be found through romantic relationships or lifelong friendships. But here I was, surrounded by a community of people who saw me, respected me, and valued me for who I was. They didn't know my whole story, but they connected with the parts of me that were woven into my work. And for the first time, that felt like enough. As I walked home from the gallery one night, under a sky filled with stars, I thought about how much my life had changed. It wasn't the life I'd once imagined, but it was beautiful in ways I hadn't thought possible. I realized that my journey would always be evolving, that I would always be discovering new facets of myself and new ways to give back to the world. Maybe someday I'd meet someone new, someone who would share this life with me in a way that felt natural, unforced. But I wasn't in a rush. I wasn't searching for someone to complete me. I was whole on my own, and anything beyond that would simply be an addition to a life that was already full. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, days when the memories would resurface, and I'd have to remind myself of everything I'd overcome. But I also knew that I was no longer the person who had been defined by betrayal or heartbreak. I was a creator, a friend, an artist, a man who had learned to love himself and his life again. In the end, it wasn't the story I'd planned, but it was a story I was proud to live. And as I stood under that night sky, feeling the cool air on my face, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I would face it with an open heart and a fierce belief in my own strength. Because, finally, I had come home to myself. Months after the art exhibit, I was still riding a wave of contentment that felt effortless. I'd built a life on my own terms, one rooted in my creative work, self-respect, and personal joy. But just when I thought I'd found my rhythm, life surprised me again, this time in a way that felt like a gentle invitation rather than a challenge. One afternoon, I received an invitation from Carol, the gallery owner, to attend a casual gathering for local artists and writers. She'd mentioned it would be a relaxed evening, a chance to meet others who were just as passionate about their work. It was exactly the kind of thing I'd started to enjoy. These small connections with people who lived creatively, who shared their inner worlds through art and words. So I accepted, looking forward to a night of good conversation and new ideas. The gathering was at a local artist's home, a cozy space filled with eclectic artwork, shelves overflowing with books, and a warmth that put everyone at ease. There was a small group of us painters, poets, photographers, and writers, each person carrying their own stories, their own journeys. I found myself lost in conversation, laughing easily, talking about art and life in ways that felt natural, unguarded. Then I met Sarah. She was a writer, about my age, with a quick smile and a warmth that made me feel instantly comfortable. We started talking about our creative processes, comparing the way words and paint could capture emotions, how art could express things we couldn't always say out loud. There was something refreshingly real about her, a quiet confidence that came from her own struggles and triumphs. She didn't pry into my past, and I didn't feel the need to explain. We simply connected, two people who understood the value of solitude and creativity. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I crossed paths more frequently, often at the same galleries or local events. We'd share coffee, talk about our latest projects, and swap stories about life's small adventures. There was no rush, no pressure to define what we were to each other. We were two people moving at our own pace, savoring the moments without expectation. In a way, Sarah reminded me of the best parts of myself, the parts I'd rediscovered after years of being buried beneath layers of other people's needs. She valued her independence just as much as I did, understood the need for space and solitude, and appreciated the beauty of a quiet connection. It was refreshing, and over time, I realized that our bond had grown into something that felt like friendship with a hint of something more. But this time, I wasn't in a rush to label it or shape it into a specific form. I'd learned that love, when it was genuine, didn't need to be forced or rushed. It unfolded naturally, like a flower blooming in its own time, and I was content to let it unfold as it wished, savoring each step, each new layer of understanding we discovered about each other. One evening, as we sat at a small cafe, watching the world pass by, Sarah asked me about my art. She'd seen my work in the gallery and wanted to know what drove me to paint, what I hoped to capture on each canvas. I paused, surprised by the question. I hadn't thought about it in those terms before. My art had always been an expression of whatever was happening inside me, a way to process emotions, to let go, to heal. As I answered, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come, not just in my art, but in my life. Painting had become more than a creative outlet. It was my way of making peace with the world, of connecting with others in ways that went beyond words. And in sharing this with Sarah, I felt a new sense of clarity, as if speaking the words out loud had solidified something within me. After that night, I found myself painting with a new purpose. I'd already healed, but now I felt ready to create art that went beyond my personal journey. I wanted to capture the quiet moments that we all experience, the feelings of connection, hope, resilience. I started working on a new series, inspired by the simple beauty I saw in the people around me. In moments of solitude and shared laughter, in the resilience of the human spirit. And as I painted, I realized that my dreams had evolved. I was no longer painting to heal from a broken past. I was painting to celebrate a life that felt full and rich in ways I hadn't expected. My life had become my own, and now I wanted to share that joy with others. Sarah continued to be a presence in my life, her quiet encouragement and understanding making the journey even more fulfilling. Our connection grew slowly, marked by easy conversations, shared silences, and moments of laughter that felt like pure joy. I found myself looking forward to her company, enjoying the gentle way she'd become part of my world without disrupting the balance I'd worked so hard to achieve. But I also knew that, if our paths were to diverge, I'd be okay. I wasn't afraid of loneliness anymore, because I'd learned that solitude could be a source of strength, a place to reconnect with myself. I knew that I would always carry my own wholeness, that I didn't need anyone else to make me complete. Whatever Sarah and I had, it was a beautiful addition to my life, but it wasn't a requirement for my happiness. As the months passed, I realized I was living the life I'd always dreamed of, a life filled with creativity, independence, and connection. I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. I was growing, exploring, and discovering new parts of myself every day, and with each step forward, I felt a deeper sense of peace and gratitude. One evening, as Sarah and I sat on a bench overlooking the city, she turned to me and asked, "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard, and I took a moment to reflect before answering. I looked at her, at the city lights sparkling in the distance, at the life I'd built piece by piece, and I realized that, yes, I was happy, truly, deeply happy. "I am," I replied, feeling the weight of the words settle in. "I really am." And as we sat there, side by side, watching the world pass by, I felt a profound sense of contentment wash over me. This life, this journey, it had been filled with twists and turns, with heartbreak and healing, with loss and discovery, but through it all, I'd found my way back to myself, to a place where I could stand strong and free, open to whatever lay ahead. The road that had once felt so lonely and uncertain was now filled with possibility, with the beauty of a future that was entirely my own. And for the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was truly living. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all.